welcome and thank you all for attending this ESSEC Alumni Impact Workshop, 1 hour to understand biodiversity in business with Marie-Anne Vincent, ESSEC 2005, and Jules Chandellier, ESSEC 2009. So a huge thanks both of you, and it's your turn now.
Thanks, Sonia, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for connecting during this lunchtime. Happy to animate this workshop with Jules. I think Jules is like 2014, like much younger than me. I graduated a long time ago. We wanted to give you a bit of context. I understand from Sonia that there were like some requests to understand better like the context of biodiversity loss, and then Jules will jump into like how to first assess the biodiversity risk of your company. And I'm not sure there was a lot of financial people in the call, so I will just keep 5 minutes at the end to explain how to start a business and biodiversity analysis for financial institution. But if there are more questions, more happy to answer during the Q&A session. You can drop all your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and Sonia will monitor that, and we will leave 15 minutes at the end to answer the questions. So feel free to drop all of them, and we will make the time at the end to answer them. And if not, we will answer by email afterwards. So Vienjana, a bit of context about biodiversity crisis and definition. And Jules will explain whatever frameworks and tools available in the market today, and then how to start with biodiversity assessment for corporates. And again, a bit of biodiversity approach for a financial institution at the end. So maybe a lot of you have seen this picture. We have been talking a lot about like inflation, recession, economic crisis, and then about climate change has been the main topic for years. But biodiversity is like a new topic, but we could see that the biodiversity wave is even like bigger than the previous ones. So the idea is to give you a bit of context and numbers. Don't be too afraid. At the end, we will try to be optimistic, but the biodiversity crisis is a bit scary, we'll see. Some experts talks about like the 6 max extinction. So to give you a bit of context, what is a mass extinction? If you talk about like anthropology, it's a short period of geological time in which a high percentage of biodiversity and species dies out. So the last one was 65 million years ago. It was like where the dinosaurs disappeared. So it was a long time ago. And when we talk about like short period of geological time, it can be like millions of years. What we can see here with the 6 mass extinction is quite different, because it's not formed and caused by natural phenomena or like, you know, the big comets coming to Earth. It's caused by human activity. And like we can see like the current extinction rates are like 1,000 times higher than the natural ones. So we can see that the human activity is having a lot of stress on the planet and the species, and experts estimate that half of the living species could go extinct by 2100. So we are in the midst of the 6 max extinction. To give you like another number is like the number of vertebrates decreased by 69% over the last 50 years. So it's kind of scary as well. Like we don't count all of them, of course, but yeah, the population of species is decreasing at a quite significant rate. To give you a bit of more like ideas and context about like, because when you talk about biodiversity, people look at the polar bear or like the cute animals, but it's much more than that, the biodiversity, because it can affect different ecosystems, different species, and like freshwater, ocean, etc. So today we estimate that 75% of the land area has been significantly altered, maybe through agriculture or urbanization, etc. 3% of the ocean surface is considered as wild, so it's not much anymore. And sometimes now we can see as well there's like the new oceans of like the plastic oceans coming up. So definitely caused by human activity. 85% of wetland area has been lost, and we will see that it's key to have this wetland area for regulation of many things in terms of biodiversity. and 90% of land is projecting to be significantly altered by 2050. Again, we will talk about that, but give you this kind of, big numbers in mind is like we're talking about GHG emissions for years now, but like in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems and nature, like the problem is getting much bigger. When we talk about ecosystems, we've seen that there's a lot of like percentage of land altered, mainly new by cities, like because the population is growing a lot everywhere in the world. Because of cities, like urban areas doubled since 1992. The rainforests, because of agriculture, palm oil, etc. Like there's an equivalent of a football pitch lost every 6 seconds. So it's quite of huge in terms of surfaces, like if we put like something quite concrete. And of course, like terrestrial area has been used a lot for intensive agriculture and using a lot of fresh water resources. Maybe some of you have seen these planetary boundaries. So the Stockholm Resilience Center map 9 planetary boundaries. 6 of them has been crossed. Climate change, you can see that it's getting yellow, but biodiversity has been crossed in red for many years now, meaning that when you talk about GHG emissions, we still talk about a budget. We need to be carbon neutral by 2050. We should decrease the emission, but we can still emit. We need to adapt, of course, but we can still emit a little bit. For biodiversity, we cross the line where biodiversity is so altered, so it's difficult for the planet to restore by itself. So we really need to make the effort to restore biodiversity and to reduce biodiversity loss. But the second part of restoration is key because we need to help the planet to restore by itself again. So it's for the planet, but also for us, because today, like the world GDP is heavily dependent of nature and its ecosystemic services. Half of the GDP in the world is dependent of all the nature, of food, medicine, water, land use, etc. We definitely need the nature, so we need to protect it so that we can still have a comfortable life in the future. To live with a happy note, we could see during the COVID that nature can grow back very quickly when we leave the nature by itself. So there's a group of experts working on how to be nature positive by 2030, like the way we see like we need to limit global warming by 1.5 or 2 degrees. So that's part of what we discussed during the COP15 about biodiversity in Montreal a year and a half ago, is how to increase conservation efforts, how to have a more sustainable production and more sustainable consumptions, so that we make sure that we leave some time and some space to nature to restore. Why we've been like so long to talk about biodiversity while we've been talking about climate and carbon for so many years, sometimes difficult to grasp the notion of biodiversity. And so now there's been some work done by the IPBES, which is the equivalent of the IPCC for climate. Is what's the definition of biodiversity, how to quantify biodiversity impact and biodiversity loss. And that's where, when you know the state of play, you can work on the actions. So biodiversity is much wider and more complex than climate because, for example, biodiversity is the diversity of ecosystems, the diversity of species, and the diversity of genes within the species. Why the diversity of ecosystems? Because you can see that between the rainforest, the mangroves, the tundra, or the forest in Europe, there's many like different ecosystems with different species and different equilibriums. So we need to take that into account, especially like there's been something saying like it's great to plant trees for carbon capture, but planting trees, which is not like natural inhabitants in the rainforest, doesn't really make sense because we need to respect the ecosystem and we need to respect these equilibriums. Diversity of species, of course. So that's the nice tigers and jaguars, but in terms of insects and bacteria and fish and corals, etc., we need to have a lot of diversities of species to make sure that we respect these equilibriums as well. And diversity of genes, not sure we talk a lot about that, but today, if there's like fewer and fewer members of one within a species, it's difficult because you don't have diversity of DNA. Because if one species is attacked by a disease and within its genes cannot fight against it, like you will see the whole species disappear. So it's good like to have different members within a species to ensure like the diversity of genes and to ensure like the resilience of a species in the coming years. I won't go through all these 27 ecosystemic services delivered by the planet, but you can see that there's many things supporting like the profitability and the life on the planet with soils, nutrition, and like provisioning services like for us having some food, some water, fresh water, like most of the medicines and that we know today are coming from plants. So we need to, we're highly dependent of that. Regulation services, but climate, water consumptions, pollination, like key for all the agriculture. And something that's quite unusual as well is cultural services, like a lot of paintings, and when you go to the beach and when you're on your holidays, when you want to enjoy nature, and that's part of the ecosystemic services that the planet is providing. The IPBES in 2019 start to explain how to measure the impact on biodiversity and how to grasp these impacts is through 5 main drivers. It's land use, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. And that's how now we assess biodiversity through these 5 main drivers, and that's how we implement action plans for each of them. Just example again, for land use, as we said before, 30% of terrestrial land has been used by agriculture. For direct resource exploitation, 90% of fish stocks have been overexploited. Which is, when we say like we need to regulate and like there's been a lot of discussion at the European Commissions to reduce, overfishing because we need to let the nature restore a little bit. Climate change, we talk about rising temperatures. It's just, in the past, when there was being a warming environment, the species had the time to migrate and adapt, and took like decades and centuries to adapt to their local environments. Today, global warming is increasing so fast that the species don't have time to adapt. Like when it was very hot last year, as human, we can have air conditioning, we can go to the shade, or we can find some solutions to, hide from the very high temperature. But for all the species, it's complicated. Like, they don't get the water, they don't get hydrated, like they suffer, and they don't have time to migrate to adapt. So climate change is a big topic as well for biodiversity loss. Pollution, like we have seen this huge plastic pollution in the ocean and trying to find like some technological solutions to remove this plastic from the ocean. But clearly pollution is everywhere. Chemical pollution, plastic pollution, we need to find a solution for that. And invasive species, because of globalization, like there are some species that has been moved in some parts. Like in Australia, you've got some rabbits, there's been there, but there's no predator. So how do you deal with this kind of species who don't have a predator locally? Or same with plants, you've got plants that, remove like the local species, and it's kind of difficult to act on that. So it's my time, try to limit that to 15 minutes. It's a lot of information, I hope you're not too depressed. I leave the floor to Jules now.
Thank you very much, Marie-Anne. And hi, everyone. So for the second part, we'll discuss, now that we know a bit more about the context and what is biodiversity and what are we talking about, what's the link with businesses, with the organization in which we work every day, and how can we better try to integrate this question of biodiversity within our daily activities. Yeah. Yeah, perfect. So I think that first, before getting into what's the link between biodiversity and business and how to integrate it, the first question is to understand why we are doing it or why we want to do it in the future. And for this, there's four main drivers of it. So first one is the regulatory requirement. So this is basically when you don't really have the choice to do it, and it's a very strong driver, as you can imagine, and it's getting more and more momentum at the moment on biodiversity, and it follows a bit what has been done on climate, and now climate reporting is mandatory for most companies, depending on the size. But we have the same thing happening for biodiversity, and France was a pioneering country with the Article 29. And now we have more and more regulation at the European level with the CSRD, which will require more and more companies to report on their impact and risk linked to biodiversity. So this is something to follow when you have a business, because yeah, there's more and more regulation to be aligning with. The second driver for some company, not all, is funding requirements. So getting access to capital through banks or other organization is more and more constrained by your action and how you integrate biodiversity into your activities. So here I've put IFC Performance Standard 6, which is one of the international good practice on biodiversity developed by the IFC, which is the private financing branch of the World Bank. And for instance, if you want to get access to funding through the World Bank, then your project needs to align with these performance standards. So this is another reason why you would want to actually take into account these biodiversity questions into your business. A third driver is voluntary requirements. So we'll see that there's a lot of emerging frameworks at the moment which are trying to help companies to better understand, better integrate through frameworks biodiversity within their activities. And so these frameworks are not regulatory, so they're not mandatory for now, and they can be used voluntarily by different actors. So I'll touch a word upon these frameworks a bit later, but the two most widely known are the Science-Based Targets Network, which also exists, which first existed for climate and now has developed a biodiversity part, and the TNFD, which existed for climate also through the TCFD. So yeah, there's a lot happening in the business world at the moment. If you want to get help through these voluntary frameworks, that's very useful for a lot of companies. And the fourth, and I hope probably one of the biggest driver at the moment, is societal expectations, and I would add awareness to that. So I hope that lots of people within company want to better integrate biodiversity question in their daily job, because they understand more and more how important this is, and how addressing societal goals and environmental question is key to to long-term sustainability of their company. And so that pushes company to embrace good practice for biodiversity and climate, and to also not focus only on reducing the negative side, but also to focus on how can a company bring some positive outcome to biodiversity. So yeah, next slide, please. So I'll just this is a bit a small figure just to show that there's a booming of initiatives around biodiversity which are targeting business at the moment, and it's good to have a better understanding of them, because These initiatives can be a bit overwhelming because there's a lot of them. So when we start, we don't really know where to look for, what to look for, what's important, what's not, what's relevant for business or not. So we've tried here to give a bit of a framework to understand. So on top left, you have what are societal and national targets. So these, for instance, the convention, the UN Convention of Biological Diversity, host the COP. So we had the COP on climate. There's also the COP on biodiversity. And so this is the big global framework on biodiversity. You have the global biodiversity framework, which have some objectives at the scale of the world, basically, to where we should go and what we should do for biodiversity. And then we have another initiative, which is the Nature Positive initiative, which is trying to gather as much organization, individual, NGO, civil society together to frame a nature positive future for everyone. Then you have some on the bottom left, all the disclosure frameworks, which are some more regulatory ones, such as the CSRD, which are trying to frame some reports so that companies can actually report their impact, what they're doing on biodiversity, what they're not doing, through some similar frameworks, so that everyone can compare a bit and have a coherent understanding of what they should report on. Then you have some assessment framework, which are on the bottom right. So as you can see, usually those assessment framework are coupled with other type of frameworks. So we were talking about the TNFD, so which is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. TNFD is in both structure because even though it's a voluntary framework, they give a good reporting framework for companies. So you have 4 pillars in the TNFD, which was questions under these 4 pillars, which companies need to answer to actually report. But they also have an assessment part, which is called the LEAP framework, which is a very step-by-step framework for company to follow, with a lot of guidance document to help company to actually answer the question they need to report on. And finally, you have a lot of, on the top right, you have a lot of initiatives which are especially for companies, which are helping companies to set their targets and to understand better what they can do. So we have Act for Nature, which is helping companies to set some realistic targets on biodiversity. And you have some initiatives which are more focused on finance, with finance for biodiversity, for instance. So yeah, you have a lot to see around this. Then how can you actually start as a business, start doing some more work and better integrating biodiversity? You have a lot of frameworks that are out that can help you understand where you need to go and how you need to think about it. So here on the right hand side, you have one from WBCSD, which is, I quite like it because it's one of the simplest one, I would say, because you have a lot out there which can be really complicated. And I've tried to detail it on the left side into 4 steps. So you have a first step, which is about getting ready to better integrate biodiversity within your company. And getting ready means understanding what is the issue, understanding what is your driver, as we just talked about, and what is your ambition and goal as a company to work on biodiversity. The second step would be to assess, so start getting into a bit more detail and understanding the company's impact and dependencies. We'll get into a bit more detail after this on this part of assessment. Then once you have a better assessment, better understanding of what's your impact and dependencies as a company, then you'll commit So you'll set targets and plan some actions to actually, act on these impacts and dependencies. And then the fourth step is to transform. So it's to implement those actions, is to monitor those actions to see if you have the good results you were expecting or not, and then to report. And once you're doing this year by year, you can start adapting and transforming your business to better integrate biodiversity. So this is the global step-by-step framework that you would follow. It's good to have it in mind to know where you're going, but in the next slide, I'll explain a bit more in the details what you can really do when you're starting. So yeah, next slide, please. So start now. I frame this, it can work if you're working in a big company, but also if you're in a smaller company with less resources to do this. I think that if I were in that position, I would really start understanding what's the interface of my business with nature and biodiversity. That start was understanding what is biodiversity itself, what is the biodiversity crisis, as Marie-Anne just presented to us, but also have a very good understanding of what is my activity and mapping my business to understand what are all the sectors that are linked to my business in my value chain. Maybe understanding what are the geographies linked to these sectors in my value chain, and have a very detailed understanding of what is my business will really help me understand what's the link with biodiversity. Then when you do this mapping exercise of your business, it's also good to understand, well, what data do I have access to on this value chain? Thinking about your consumers, thinking about your suppliers, what data do you have about them? Of course, better to understand what data you have related to environmental considerations. And then once you have that, you can start asking yourself, well, what does biodiversity mean in the context of this value chain mapping? You might see that in some of your suppliers, you have some of your suppliers which, well, actually, this supplier is linked to agriculture. Well, what is the type of agriculture they do, and where do they do this, the growing of these raw materials? So here you're starting to put the hand on where you might have some direct link between your business and biodiversity. That might be obvious for some of your company. Of course, if you're selling raw materials, agricultural product, then you might have a lot of data already, a good understanding of the link with biodiversity. It might be less obvious if you are producing cars, for instance, or it might be even less obvious if you're a service company. But even in a service company, you'll find that if you use paper, well, where was this paper produced from? Where were the trees they were produced from? So you always have, more or less, depending on your sector, a link with biodiversity, and it might require more or less assessment to get to see where is the link. Then when you have this understanding, I would start defining my priority areas of efforts where I want to actually act. So this is where you start to try and assess your impacts and dependencies related to your activities and biodiversity. So this, of course, will depend on the level of data you have. So you can, I'll talk about what type of tools you can use to do this, but it really depends on the type of data you have. But what I want to stress on is that you don't need to have a perfect impact assessment to understand where you want, what are your priority areas. So if you have data on one area and you think this area of your business is one of the most impactful, then just go for that. And you can start having actions in, for instance, I don't know, the upstream part of your value chain, and you'll keep developing your understanding of the other part of your value chain in the future. But then this will help you focus on one point of your operation. And I think that's really important, to not want to do everything at the same time, but just start where you have data, start where you know your activity has the most impact, so that you can start implementing action as soon as possible. So this is the third point, is act now with no regret actions. So it's about identifying all sorts of actions you can put in place, even though this might not have the biggest impact and you're not going to be transforming the whole value chain. It's always good to start acting quickly on some simple but impactful actions that just come quite obviously. Another point in the no regret action is, of course, look for initiatives, or geographic initiatives, sectoral initiatives, where people are talking about biodiversity, and make some partnership, join some like this, some webinars to start talking about biodiversity within your geographies or within your sector, because maybe some of your peers in your sector have already started doing things, and you can actually get some ideas of how to act quickly, quite easily. And then you can also get some help through those initiatives, through talking with some experts on the topic. And there's more and more available resources on biodiversity these days. So you can also look up on the internet. There's more and more fact sheets that you can find on what's the link between biodiversity and a specific sector. And I think the fourth step would be, well, when you started doing this, then there's also a part where you need to think long-term and to prepare a strategy and align with those disclosure requirements, which we've talked about just before. So understanding what you want to do in the long term, to plan your resources to put into biodiversity, to develop your vision and ambition. So it's good to know that it's great to think that, well, biodiversity is really important for my company, but what does it mean? Do you want to be the leader in biodiversity in your sector, in your region, or maybe that's not a priority right now and it's fine, but you just want to have like minimum standards, and that's already very good. But it's good to have an understanding of where you're going, and especially aligning with mandatory, of course, requirements and sometimes voluntary requirements, which can really help a company to put you on a path and just follow it, which is why these frameworks such as TNFD, which come out, is really good, because it's less of a burden for companies. You just need to follow the path. There's a lot to do, but at least you know what you need to do. So I would encourage you to have a look at these frameworks. So maybe quickly, I can give a bit of more tangible example of what we would do. So for instance, for a luxury brand, how can you start assessing your impact? Well, luxury brand have a very complex value chain, but you can start with your product. So if we say, for instance, if we take a cashmere jumper, you take your product, you ask yourself, well, what is the commodity that you have in the product? So you can split your product per commodity. So in a cashmere jumper, you would have cashmere. And then ask yourself, well, what is the link between this commodity and impact on biodiversity? Well, for instance, for cashmere, you would have some cashmere goats, and what is the impact of having cashmere goats is grazing some habitats. Usually, then you can do a bit of research. Cashmere goats, usually production is in Mongolia or China, and you would quickly find that there is quite a problem of overgrazing of cashmere goats in these areas, which therefore impact biodiversity, of course, with more competition with other mammals in this area, maybe less and less diversity of plants. So this is how you would actually understand what is the impact of your jumper on biodiversity. Next slide, please. Then you can also use some some table like this, which is understanding how your value chain put pressure on biodiversity using those 5 pressures of the IPBES, which Marie-Anne presented before. And this will help you to actually prioritize between different types of raw material that you use. So for instance, if you use paper, cotton, and wool and diamonds, like we have here, understand what is the commodity I need to prioritize, because this one is where there's the most impact on biodiversity. Well, this type of analysis will help you to choose and know where to put the more resource, because that's where you have the more impact acting on, for instance, diamonds. Well, diamonds or gemstones are, if they're produced from mining, well, then you will go back down the value chain and understand, well, maybe I need to take a bit of time to understand where my commodity come from, what are the mining practices, what are my suppliers doing about biodiversity, and that's how you start acting on biodiversity. And a big part of it is about partnership with your whole value chain. Next slide. Yeah, just to continue on this, a big part of biodiversity is local, as Marie-Anne presented before, and it's always good to go down to the local side of biodiversity, because it's good to know what are the types of impact, if it's pressure on biodiversity, such as land use change. Land use change can be because of mining, for instance, but then it's good to understand where this mining impact occur on the planet, because biodiversity is not homogeneously distributed on the planet, and the significance, the importance of biodiversity around the planet is not the same everywhere. So of course, it's important to understand, well, did this mine happen in the middle of France, where there might be less important biodiversity left, or did it happen in the middle of the forest, tropical forest in Congo, where there's a lot of biodiversity left, a lot of important biodiversity left, which is more important to preserve and protect today. So always good to go down to the local level of your impact, if possible, of course. I'll maybe jump this because we don't have much time, but go after this again. Yes, so navigating biodiversity tools. So today I've been talking a lot about looking at the local level, but also assessing your impact and dependencies. There are a lot of tools and more out there today. One good tool to start looking, if you have local areas where your company produce, or you know that your suppliers produce, you can easily have a look at what is the impact, what is the importance of this area for biodiversity. So for instance, IBAT, the integrated biodiversity assessment tool, is a good tool to have a look and start understanding, well, are my suppliers located in protected area, or there's a lot of different biodiversity sensitive area which are indicated in the maps. But also understand, well, I need to build a new plant for my company. How can I best choose the area to have less impact on biodiversity? There's a lot of geospatial data layers that you can use, and you can find a lot of them on the internet, and I would recommend to go through them. The best one, IBAT is a very good one. There's a lot of different layers. The world, for instance, there's the world protected area layers, which is a geospatial tool that you can access freely, and you can see all the protected areas that occur in the world. So that's pretty easy to have a look at. Then for impact and dependencies, there's this very pragmatic tool, which is called ENCORE, which has been developed by the UN Environmental Program. And you can, on their website, just have a input your sector, your sub-industry, where you are in the production process, and then have a look at dependencies and impact to start understanding what are your main sources of impact and what are your main sources of dependencies. So this is very good to start getting a better understanding of where actually the impacts are. It can also be an interesting tool to start prioritizing if you work in different sectors, in different sub-industry, to have a prioritizing exercise to understand where to put some more efforts. It's a very good tool to get started. And then in the I didn't put the link, but there is some tool register around biodiversity, because I think there's more than 150 tools that are identified in this tool catalog. So you have it in the TNFD website. If you write tools catalog TNFD, you will see a lot of tools that might be relevant. It might be focused on a certain sector. So I encourage you to have a look at this also. And maybe just to finish, next slide, please. Yeah, I think it's always good to have in mind the challenges and limitation of integrating biodiversity within your organization. First, to know that these are common challenges, that you are not alone in this, but it's also good to anticipate a bit what might happen. So first challenge is that many companies are starting from scratch, meaning that there is a key point in awareness and education that you cannot skip before getting into the nitty-gritty of impact and dependencies assessment. So yeah, this is the second point, that you require this awareness raising part is very important. And I would add awareness at all levels of the company, not just the people, not just the environmental team. I think it's really important to get awareness down to every teams and also up to management teams. I think it's fair to say that there is a bit of fatigue in environmental topics in companies today. After a long period of developing climate strategies and commitment, a lot of companies are feeling, well, now, okay, we thought it was good, now we need biodiversity. So I think it's good to say that it's a fair feeling to have, especially in big groups where there's a lot of process to be put in place. But a lot of biodiversity work is trying to build on climate work. So to trying to align with what has been done on climate, not to reinvent everything again, and to actually incorporate climate and biodiversity within the same initiative. Another point is that the market is booming. So as I said, it can be confusing. There's a lot of regulation, a lot of initiative, a lot of agreement concept. So I think it's good that to join one initiative, focus on it, but also get help if you need. So there's a lot of more and more webinars to get help, NGOs that can help, consulting company that can help you to better understand and navigate this booming market. And the last point, which is key challenge that we face every day with our client, is access to data. So I think it's after the awareness phase, the data phase, I think is the most important before being too ambitious on what you want to do, reflecting on what data do I have access to right now, so that I can actually implement what I want and do the analysis that I want. So yeah, this is, I hope it wasn't too much information, but there's a lot to do, and I'm very happy for you to start and answer questions after.
Okay, so thanks, Jules, because it was very interesting and to have a concrete example about cashmere and cashmere goats in Mongolia. Typically a good example on how land use and having goats everywhere can challenge biodiversity. Just for context, so I'm head of sustainable investment at AXA Climate. So I've got a length of career behind me about finance. That's why I will just say a few words about financial institution here. And I think you can replicate what you just said about a company. It's just like for an investors, you have to pile up all the portfolio companies you've got in your loan book or your investment portfolio to understand like the main challenges of your investments. Maybe you've heard about the concept of double materiality because it's talk a lot about CSRD at the moment. I think it's even more relevant for biodiversity because you've got this double dependency that we can clearly see for the companies and for the investors. When you invest in a company, you want to know what's the impact on the planet and biodiversity because you want to protect the planet and you want to protect your investment in the coming years. But you want to understand as well the dependency of your company towards the service ecosystemic, the economic, the system, the planet services, because the profitability of your investment will depend of this dependency. So the relationship between the two is very important, and the assessment of the two. Like an example, there's a massive disappearance of pollinating insects, so that will have an impact about like the food and the textile production, so that will impact the price of food and the price of textiles, and they will generate like food security and economic losses for agriculture, consumer goods, and all the fashion industry. You can see that's coming from one little insect, one little bee, can have a lot of impact at the end, and that's what we can see at the moment. So the concept of double materiality is key for financial institutions and the portfolio companies to understand like both sides of biodiversity. Jules explained like all the frameworks. I won't go into details again, but just to say that the Article 29 of the Loi Énergie Climat in France was the first law, mandatory law everywhere in the world to address biodiversity, and especially was addressed for financial institutions to understand the biodiversity impact of their investments. So like already 2 years ago, financial institution has to write this report, understand the risk, understand the dependency, and try to map if their investment were close to protected areas or protected species. It was kind of complicated at the beginning because, again, as you say, like the access to the data, understanding of the concept and the stakes was very difficult at that time. But coming from the financial institutions and like going down to the portfolio companies, we can see that now we've got the SFDR, which is like for financial institution, they have to report, for example, the indicators number 7 about like, does my investment impact negatively like protected areas, the CSRD, the E4, they ask for companies to start thinking about a transition plan in line with the biodiversity frameworks. So we can see that it's moving, and now financial actors need to take that into account, like the portfolio alignment towards the biodiversity restoration. There's many ways to do that. You can start with the classic one, like exclusion policy. I will remove all the sectors that have a negative impact on planet and nature. Geographical exclusion as well, because as Jules said, like from IBAT, for example, it's a tool where you can map all the protected areas for biodiversity, all the like endangered species. And that's good because you can start thinking, when I start investing, build a factory, invest in a wind field, you can see where are the protected areas and when we need to put the efforts. Another classic investment approach in finance is a best-in-class approach. So if you want to invest in a sector, you want to choose the companies that have to start thinking about a transition plan for biodiversity, a credible transition plan, or if they are starting to think about, if not like biodiversity is not mentioned, but water resources, reforestation, like deforestation as well, like, and all these kind of the 5 drivers of biodiversity. That's something.
I think we had a little connection issue, but it's coming back.
Yes, but just to finish, it's just to explain, like after the best-in-class approach, you've got the engagements, and like because the financial institutions have a lot of pressure from the regulators, from the investment, etc., they need to start engaging with the companies, and like together the private public sectors will start thinking and have an open dialogue about biodiversity restoration. I will start here because anyway, I don't know why, but my screen doesn't want to share the presentation anymore, and that will leave us like 5 minutes to answer questions.
Thank you very much, both of us. It was very interesting and a lot of good information, rich information. So we have one question. And so thanks for your presentation. It seems that the topic of biodiversity is rather big and complex. In the session, we heard about how to access your company. However, do you mind giving us some pros and cons respectively of doing the research internally and outsourcing the assessment to the professionals? And lastly, which approach of assessment do you think is better from your perspective?
Yeah, I can give a first answer. And so if I understand well, so yeah, what is better between internally doing your biodiversity assessment or outsourcing it to professionals? I think well, first, I think it's a question of resources in terms of knowledge resources. It would take a lot of time for a company who has no resources in biodiversity or in environmental profiles in the company to start doing its assessment on its own. But at this, I mean, it would definitely need a lot of financial resources to hire the right people and then to get started. But at the same time, there's also a lot of financial resources to put on the table to get supported externally. I would say that getting support externally is a good thing because it means that you would work with people who already know what's the most effective assessment, and with people who already have the knowledge around this, so it would be much more efficient for your company. At the same time, I think that for a company which want to have a long-term engagement in this topic, I think it's not possible to only have external support, and I think it's I mean, it's what I think every company should do to want to have a long-term engagement. So I think there might be the two approach might be the best. Maybe if you want to start, if you have an ambition and you want to start doing things now, it might be a good thing to get some support. So you could get support from some private consultancies, which might require a bit more financial resources, but you can also get some support from some NGOs, which have also very good resources and which might cost less. But at the same time, I think that engaging in awareness raising and environmental education within your company is something that you must do, even if you're getting some external support.
And just maybe to complete, I think it's key to have someone in the company to understand the stakes and, like, you know, mobilize and to have some ambassador. The topic might be complex, but like it was 10 years ago for carbon, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, valid emission, etc. And, you know, don't wait to have everything to start. And as you say, there's like some, like the biodiversity consultancy or ESSEC Climate, like there's some expert on biodiversity and nature. They can help you to train your staff, to train yourself, to understand the key stakes of your business, to give you the right tools to start. And after, train your people. And then after, you can, you know, pilot the implementation. But clearly, it has to be both. Don't effectively, as you said, hire a lot of people in the company. The data sets, there's a lot of public data available. But if you go to IBAT, if you go to Encore, if you go to Star, etc., you have multiple data sets and you can get to be completely lost. At ESSEC Climate, we launched a platform called Altitude where we already embedded all these data sets, try to make it simple, because the idea is to kind of demystify biodiversity, saying it's too complicated, so I don't start. The idea is you put your assets, you put your factories, you put your investment and your portfolio companies, and you get a sense of where are my risk, what the top exposure, where should I start? And after you can get some help and you can train your people. But yeah, the idea is to start, as you said, because the clock is ticking and clearly we need other people to work on that.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there's other questions, maybe. If you want to open your mic, it's okay.
There is another
from
question
Marie.
from Marie, yes.
So far, we found no
yes.
KPIs that can easily be explained internally and justify the budget allocated to biodiversity. Maybe in the past couple of years, because biodiversity is quite new, there was like some indicators. Sorry, it was my last slide, couldn't be displayed, but you've got some like indicators, like aggregated indicators like the MSA, like the mean species abundance, or the PDF, more with an LCA approach. But what we can see is it's kind of difficult to tell a story with aggregated indicators. But if you go back to the pressures, if you go back to water resources or land use, if I am in agriculture or business, or if you go to pollution, chemical pollution, if you are industry, you can start understanding your KPIs and your footprint and how to act on it. And each business is specific. So each sector has maybe his own KPIs. You don't have to do everything for all the sectors. The objective is to have something quite understandable for your own business. So that's why the first of what is material for my business, as you said, where should I start is key. And after you will find the right KPI with some help or internally, but you will find the right KPI to disclose. Yeah, it's the slide just after. So yeah, that one.
Yeah, thank you, Damas. So sorry also for the no camera. I'm with my baby here. It's a bit messy. But yeah, thanks for that. We had some KPIs on biodiversity that came from some research work, and they were attached to an LCA work also, but it was absolutely impossible to explain it to the buyers or to anyone within the company. So we are discussing it with the consultancy. And even themselves, they said, yeah, maybe it's not the best KPI if you want them to translate the work done and the improvement done internally. And that was a bit the struggle to find, I need to motivate buyers and we need to spend some money on this. And then the struggle was to find something very simple to say, but see, yes, look, we have an impact or there is some improvement. And then my thinking was like, actually, maybe KPIs are not even that relevant. Maybe we should frame it differently, and I should frame the progress differently than with KPI and try to set that internally.
Yes, and there's, yeah, totally. That's a very difficult exercise, especially if you're using those KPIs to then motivate financial resources. I think that there's it's hard when we don't know the business we're talking about, but there's a lot of different KPIs that a lot of different levels at which you can put some KPIs to show that you have some good actions. I think that first KPIs, if you have defined your targets, and there's again a lot of different types of targets you can set, then it would definitely help to define the good KPIs, so you can have some targets over actions, targets over pressures on biodiversity. But also I think that very special and very localized KPIs are very good and essential when in terms of monitoring your action and in terms of monitoring your action on biodiversity. But as Marie-Anne said, it's hard to do some storytelling around it. And also maybe it's the higher level storytelling that you need to work on before trying to say something with a specific KPI, because also when you start linking biodiversity with financial aspects, it's a much longer term in which you need to have a look. So yeah, the storytelling might be better somewhere else. But also, and I'll finish by saying that KPIs also, it's good if you can have KPIs looking at the reduction of impact, but also KPIs looking at the promoting positive outcome for biodiversity. But yeah, it really depends on what type of business we're talking about. But KPIs is definitely a difficult topic. And if you haven't yet, you can look at TNFD, which shows some KPIs on biodiversity, but it's still very, very broad.
Thanks a lot for your input. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think it's time. Thank you so much, Jules and Marie-Anne. It was very, very, very interesting. Share with you guys the presentation and the recording. Maybe you want to add the last words, Jules and Marie-Anne?
Well, thanks everyone for your questions and your attentions, and we hope they will give you some tools to start on biodiversity. And feel free to reach out to us if you need anything on the topic.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And yeah, definitely send us a message if you have a further question. And yeah, continue to educate yourself on the topic. Very important. Thank you very much.